Okay, we are live.
We are reconvening our morning hearing and shifting gears to the Wildlife Action Plan. Welcome.
Thank you. For the record, my name is Rosalind Renfrew. I am the Wildlife Diversity Program Manager at Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. And I appreciate you inviting me to speak here about the Vermont State Wildlife Action Plan. I think it's sometimes under the radar and we would like to change that. So this is a great opportunity. I appreciate it. Before I get started, I do want to acknowledge my appreciation for John Cart, my colleague at Fish and Wildlife, who actually does the vast majority of the work to coordinate the Wildlife Action Plan process. It's a lot of work. It's a heavy lift that he does on top of his usual duties. And so shout out to my colleague, John, for all his hard work making the Wildlife Action Plan a success.
I don't want to, but I just want to make sure that we all understand
Mhm.
there's a state wildlife action plan and then there's also a federal one. Is that right? That we're required to do both.
We just are required to do the state wildlife action plan. There are many states most states also have their own wildlife action plan. We also roll these up to regional planning efforts and sometimes national. But there's no national wildlife action plan that I'm aware of.
Oh, and there aren't two, that one is a federal, so we can get our federal funding, and then one that meets state statute.
No, we actually do our state wildlife action plan in order to get federal funding, and I'll explain that.
Okay, great.
So the action plan is very tightly tied and part of our mission at the department to conserve fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats for all the people in Vermont. It's a plan that's not just for our department or agency, it's for all of Vermont. And it's a blueprint for wildlife and habitat conservation. It focuses on species that are most in need of conservation. We find that it's important to prioritize given the many needs and limited resources. So this is a plan to help bring people around a set of priorities that we can all row the boat together on. And the point and the purpose of the plan is to conserve, enhance, and restore Vermont's wildlife and its habitat, identify those priorities, represent the best available science and conservation planning, engage Vermonters in wildlife conservation, and provide these statewide priorities that, as I said, are rolled up to contribute to regional planning as well. So as I was just mentioning to the chair, the plan is actually required in order for us to receive some of our federal dollars. It's called the State Wildlife Grant. This is funding specifically for certain suites of species, certain taxonomic groups. It especially is focused on dealing with threatened and endangered species, both federal and state threatened and endangered. But also, really importantly, it's for all those species that aren't yet listed, and we really want to put the work in to prevent them from becoming listed. Not only is this good conservation, it's more efficient and it's good makes good financial dollar sense, because it's been shown time and again that if you wait until something is so rare that it's listed and needs to be saved, it's many times more expensive than just preventing it from becoming listed in the first place. So this is a really important piece of the plan as well. But also, you need to prioritize which are the species that we need to work on to prevent them from becoming listed. The plan needs to be updated every 10 years for us to receive this funding. That sounds like a long time, but know that it's also somewhat flexible. So if there are new emerging threats, it's not like the plan dictates that we can't make any changes to what we do programmatically. This is really not prescriptive as much as a guide. And as I mentioned, most states and even territories, Canadian territories, have a wildlife action plan and go through the same process that Vermont does every 10 years. And just to get a handle on that funding over the years, we began receiving funding in 2002 from state wildlife grants, or we call SWIGs. And then in 2005 is when they required that we start actually having a plan, which I think makes a lot of sense. And although it's It's varied over the years. You can see in recent years, it's fairly level, which is actually becoming a challenge due to all the increases in what everything costs. We're having to try to do the same work with less and less bang for the buck. We are required to provide a 35% match to the plan. So with the almost $600,000 that we receive, we have to come up with another 210 in order to receive those funds. We do not receive those federal funds unless we provide that match. And very little of that match comes from any state general funds. It's almost all volunteer hours, partner in-kind contributions, and also very importantly is the non-game fund. You're probably familiar with this on your tax checkoff. It's vital in order for us to be receiving these federal funds because we need that match. Here's a little bit about the fund. We receive the money through the tax checkoff and also through specific license plates you might be familiar with seeing around. And maybe, hopefully, some of you have one of these plates. And you can see here the distribution of the funds. That's just general. It varies from year to year. Importantly, we match federal funds as much as possible with these funds whenever possible, to the extent possible. So when people contribute to this fund, they give $1, but they're actually getting $2 or $3 out of it because of the federal piece. So the plans are fairly flexible in terms of what the states choose to include in them, but there are 8 required elements in the plan. First is, and I'll talk about this a lot, is the identification and the distribution and abundance of species of greatest conservation need. Their name describes them pretty well. These are prioritized species that are, again, on that sort of watch list of what do we want to work on so that they don't become listed species. I will refer to these as SGCN because it's a little shorter, a little awkward, not the best term, but it's what's used across the country. We're also required to describe the location, conditions of their habitats to the best of our knowledge. Our knowledge varies widely depending on the species we're talking about. We know a lot about birds, we know less about invertebrates. And then any key threats to their populations. And I want to emphasize populations because this plan really operates on how the populations of species are faring. And then also the research needs, if there are any, to figure out what those key threats are in the case of a lot of species that we know less about. So overall, when we talk about species of greatest conservation need, or SGCN, we're talking about those species in the biodiversity crisis that are sort of next to fall off, right? The next ones that will be the next to go if the biodiversity crisis continues to occur.
Can you just make sure we're not guessing and tell us who that is in the picture?
That's a lemming. They're incredibly cute.
We have them in Vermont.
We do, although we know very little about their distribution. We know their habitat preferences from other places. Other elements required in the plan include actions to address the threats that we identify, monitoring, if possible, to assess whether or not our conservation actions are having a positive impact, or to assess just how to figure out in the first place how the populations are doing. And then again, it's adaptive. It's updated every 10 years. And also we can switch gears when new threats emerge in between those planning processes. Two of the most important elements of the plan are engagement with other people. Like I said, this is for all of Vermont, not just Fish and Wildlife. So we coordinate with other wildlife organizations, land planning or planners, other conservation organizations, and we engage with the public. We provide an opportunity for input because we need to make sure that this plan is that people are on board with the priorities that the scientific experts establish are needed for these populations. This is a family. I just wanted to include this family. They're awesome. They run a little rubber duck race every year where you sign up for a number. on the bottom of the duck and they run them down the streams and they catch them all. Don't worry. And you know, they raise money for the non-game fund that way. And they just do this out of their own interest and valuing the program. It's just really great. So in essence, the plans are for figuring out how species are doing, what are the problems they're facing, what can we do about it, and engaging people because it requires that everybody take part. So our first plan, like I said, was in 2005. This was a huge undertaking. We had to establish all the information, the baseline information about all of the species that were considered priority and start this whole ranking process, looking at all the species of Vermont and figuring out which ones were in greatest need of conservation action. So this was a big project. We reached out to a lot of different people, even if their work didn't totally overlap, because we wanted to make sure people were comfortable with this effort, could support it, and could see ways that their own work would intersect with it. And in the 2015 revision, we made a few changes. A lot of it is just revising that species list, revising with new threats, revising with new actions to address those threats. But also the revision in 2015 added a chapter on climate change. Obviously, that was coming up as a major threat to a lot of species. It added Vermont conservation design, which you heard about from my colleague Bob Zano. And also it added plants, which previously weren't in the action plan. They developed a list of SGCN plants. This revision that we're currently in the midst of, we hope to more fully integrate Vermont conservation design into the plan because it can cover a lot of those, can kind of cover or take care of a lot of those threats that species face, especially when it comes to habitat, climate change, resilience. And then we're also adding bryophytes, mosses, lichens, and fungi as SGCN species to give us a plan with a more holistic perspective on ecosystem function. And we're also looking for ways to make the plan more user-friendly, available on the web, interactive database, and more accessible. I didn't bring the big book, but on paper, the plan is this big, and I didn't want to carry this heavy thing around and slide on the ice today. But one example of needing to make this plan more accessible is that in VNRC, at VNRC with Fish and Wildlife Department, they did a survey of 40% of the municipal plans in Vermont, and they found, or no, of the municipal plans in Vermont, excuse me, and they found that 40% of them referred to biodiversity, but fewer than 10% of them referred to SGCN species of greatest conservation need. So obviously the two are tightly linked, and we'll be looking for ways to break down this document into products that can make people more aware without having to read it through hundreds to over 1,000 species accounts. So what's been going on since the development of these plans? Some of these efforts were already underway before our first plan, but just to talk about some of the successes we've seen. Wildlife conservation in Vermont was pretty focused on birds. We have a lot more information about birds. So we knew the threats they were facing. We knew what they needed. It started with birds that were impacted by DDT. The DDT went away, major threat gone. Now they need help to establish nest sites to ensure that they had the habitat they needed to come back. Osprey was the first listed species that came off of the Vermont endangered species list. And also, we've been working with our partners at Audubon Vermont over many years to monitor peregrine falcon nest sites, another species impacted by DDT. They have come back since the mid-90s or so. And at the end there, around 2019 or so, it looks like they're declining. But what's happened is they've done so well. They've been delisted. They've come off of our high priority watch list. And we're just watching a subset of their nesting sites to ensure that we don't see any red flags going up. We don't want all that work to be lost, and we want to keep the species around. So particularly around something like avian influenza, we're really wanting to keep an eye on some of these species. So that doesn't represent a drop off in the population, just a lowering of effort to make room for the needs of other species. So here are some of the signs we would put up or Audubon Vermont would put up with our support, just closing off certain areas for certain times a year to protect the nest sites and allow them to bring back their population. Similarly with loons, Vermont Center for Eco Studies, and before that, the Vermont Institute of Natural Science have been working on loons for decades to bring them back. Over 180 volunteers are involved in this effort around the state, keeping an eye on their loons, putting out nest platforms, putting out signs to protect those nest sites that are particularly vulnerable. And it's been a resounding success. They keep increasing. Eric Hansen, the loon biologist, is surprised himself to see that the adult population anyway continues to rise. And you can see that those yellow dots are the number of chicks produced, and you can see that's leveling out. That is not a concern. They are doing really well, really robust, and it might just mean that they're kind of reaching their saturation point, and the rest of the adults hanging around are sort of waiting for their chance for a good nest site. And finally, you have to talk about the bald eagle. It's come back everywhere. Also, we've been monitoring that, and you can see the decline at the end there. We've taken eyes off some of those nests and just watching a subset. Again, limited resources and other species need it. And we're feeling good about where they are now, but keeping an eye on them because of threats like avian influenza. But a lot of time and effort protecting nests to help them get reestablished in Vermont. So meanwhile, those species have all come off the list in Vermont. They're all doing well. In the meantime, other species have been added to the list. So on the left, you see on the top, eastern meadowlark, below it, the eastern whippoorwill, both species added in 2022 to our endangered species list. And then on the right, you see golden wing warbler on top and rusty blackbird on the bottom. Those are examples of bird species that are now a species of greatest conservation need. Populations are limited, declining. We need to keep an eye on them. And in the middle, that graph is a typical index from the National Breeding Bird Survey that kind of watches the big picture on bird populations. And you can see that declining trend there. I won't explain what all the lines are, but just look at the overall trend over the years of its abundance. That is the index for the rusty blackbird nationally or across North America. But if you look at the same information for any of these other species, you're going to see something that looks very similar to that. They have all declined dramatically. But birds are the charismatic species. A lot of people are birding now. It's great. People are aware of that. Beneath those, there's a ton of species that are under the radar. Invertebrates are one, but even invertebrates have been getting sort of more attention lately with bees, butterflies, monarchs. People are more aware these days, and this is really a positive thing. But you still have these species like the brook floater, an invertebrate mussel species that is on our endangered list. And it was actually just uplisted from threatened to endangered in 2022. This is one of the most imperiled mussels in the Northeast. It plays a vital role in the ecosystem. They're filter feeders. They keep the water clean. They stabilize the stream bottom for other species and provide habitats for other fish and invertebrates. And so they're really important for their own sake, but they also are important for the stabilization of this ecosystem that they live in. So they've been lost from half of the sites they used to occur in. They're confined to only the West River in Vermont, and they've declined by 85%. There's other species associated with certain habitats in Vermont. I think another thing that people are more aware of than they used to be when these wildlife action plans were first established are vernal pools and all the life that they support. The Jefferson salamander on the top there and spotted salamander and several species of frogs are all supported by these ecosystems. And so that's a situation where we look out for the vernal pools, and we're probably looking out for those species. Recent research shows that they don't just need the vernal pools. They don't just need 50 or 100 feet around them. They actually need several hundred feet all around those vernal pools because they need that area to disperse in and to live in the rest of the year. It helps with genetic flow. It increases survival. So people think of vernal pools as protect the pool and you're done, but it's actually more complex than that, as it often is with wildlife. And all the plants. We have 160 threatened and endangered plants in Vermont. We have about 1,800 vascular plants, not trees, not mosses and lichens. They are in a diversity of habitats in Vermont, including rare natural communities. A lot of them are fairly specialized, but we also just have a lot of them, and that's why so many are endangered. You're bound to have more species that are on the brink if you have more species in general, right? On the right, on the top is rue anemone, and the bottom is Houghton's sedge, both added to our list in 2022. Only 3 plant species have been delisted in Vermont, if you don't count ones that were removed because of misidentification or new genetic findings. And it goes on and on. I could be here all day talking about all kinds of other plants and animals, all kinds of different taxonomic groups. I'm just trying to give you a flavor of the breadth of the responsibility we have for all the species occurring in Vermont. And for Fish and Wildlife, we take that responsibility very seriously as part of our mission statement. So switching gears a little to talk about these species of greatest conservation need and how do we figure out which ones to deem an SGCN? We rely really heavily on our scientific advisory groups for this work. These are taxonomic experts in each of those categories you see, who advise the Endangered Species Committee of Vermont, who in turn advises Fish and Wildlife and the ANR on things like what species to list or delist, permitting, developing species recovery plans. So they do this work year round. When the Wildlife Action Plan revision comes around, most of our taxonomic teams that are working on developing those SGCN are from these groups, these scientific advisory groups, because that's really where all the expertise in Vermont is held. They do this on a volunteer basis. It's an incredible resource for us, and we couldn't get it done without them. And the amount of expertise in the room in any of these teams is pretty impressive. So what is the process they go through for determining these priority species, these SGCN species? It's really the combined opinion of that taxonomic group, that taxonomic team we call taxoteams. They figure out, is this species secure in Vermont? Do we need to be actively working on it? Or does it need special attention in order for it to stick around? And is it a high priority or is it a medium priority? If it's low priority, it's not an SGCN. Sometimes we have a lot of data that we can base that decision on. Sometimes we don't. And it really ends up being a sort of expert opinion. And people on the teams, it generally comes to a consensus decision. There's usually not any disagreement when they come out with the final list. So going into that decision are population status factors. How's the population doing? Is it trending up or down? Is it regionally significant or of regional concern? And Vermont has a lot it can do to sort of help the species on a regional level. For example, the black-throated blue warbler is in the forests of Vermont. It's doing pretty well here. We are sort of the black-throated blue warbler factory for the Northeast. And so while it might be common here, it gets some points in terms of our plan because the rest of the region is really depending on Vermont continuing to pump out that warbler and continuing to sustain it in a stable way. So you can also look at things from that point of view. And so that factors in as well. We look at what are the vulnerabilities of the species. Do they have certain life history traits? I won't go through all of these. Certain life history traits that make them vulnerable. So a good example that is a change in this plan is something like the snowshoe hare. where because we're seeing this winter potentially an exception, but because we're seeing snow melt earlier in the year, you have the snowshoe hare out in the woods, no snow around, and it's bright white. More vulnerable to predation. So that's a new vulnerability for that species. That's the sort of thing that we look at during this update, this revision of the plan. And other vulnerabilities as well. Oops. Just lost my notes. Oh, sorry about that. On track. I don't know what I did. Okay. And then there's a bunch of other factors. How well does the species diverse? How well can it, how resilient is it if there are changes in its habitat and it needs to go somewhere else? What is its relationship to the core population? Is it on the edge of its range? Is it in the core of its range? Is it an important species in the ecosystem that carries out a lot of important functions for other species? There's all kinds of considerations. This is a very short, abbreviated list of them. So this takes a long time for experts to sit around. Some are really quick and easy, and some are more of a debate about, you know, where does this species belong in this big scheme of things? And they tend to take a taxonomic group as a whole and figure out what are the top priorities within that taxonomic group, within mammals or within invertebrates, for example. So here are, you're probably the first ones to see this, are what the taxa teams have come out with in terms of their recommendations for SGCN for this new revision of the Wildlife Action Plan. I really don't want you to get too bogged down in the numbers. Just be aware that we're looking at the total number of SGCN being 1,378. And the vast majority of those are made up of invertebrates and plants, again, because we have a lot more of those than all the other taxa. And so it's a lot of species to keep track of. And in a lot of cases, the ones that the invertebrates, for example, they're the most species that we need to keep a lookout for, but also we have the least amount of knowledge. And sometimes that also factors into whether or not we want to include the species on the list. Now the teams, after coming up with the updated list of SGCN, they're now working on revising all the threats associated with each one of those species and all the potential conservation actions that could be taken to address those threats. So they're very busy in that process. So how are we engaging other people? John Cart, the Wildlife Action Plan coordinator I mentioned, sent out a survey to 180 organizations with potential interest in this and overlapping work, asking things like how relevant is the swap tier work? How do you use it? How can it better serve you? What are your thoughts about SGCN? Are there particular issues you're looking at? We also meet with our partners, look at the implications to our work, look at what they're concerned about. And we also have a public input process to give everyone the opportunity to weigh in. So you have seen this slide from Bob Zano, I'm sure of it, when he talks about Vermont conservation design, talking about the tens of thousands of species we have in Vermont, most of which haven't even been identified because they're fungi and invertebrates, a lot of them beneath the soil. And 217 are threatened or endangered, state threatened or endangered. And like I said, over 1,300 are SGCN species. So we do not have the resources to protect and conserve these species one by one and do all the actions in the wildlife action plans. How do we help these species in a more efficient way? Well, we look at natural communities. So some of those state wildlife grant monies go to protection, inventory, surveys, monitoring of our natural communities, particularly our rare natural communities across Vermont. So some of these monies, because of our wildlife action plan, are for protecting their habitat through the protection of natural communities. That could be a whole other talk. But for example, you have alpine meadows on our mountaintops they host the dwarf birch, which is an SGCN plant. You have Lake Sand Beach along the shores of Lake Champlain. They host the hairy-necked tiger beetle and spiny softshell turtles. And you have the dwarf shrub bog, natural community, grading into a black spruce bog here in this picture. The blackback woodpecker is an SGCN species using this habitat. So there's a lot you can do just protecting the natural communities. And of course, within that, you have Vermont Conservation Design focusing on where to protect those natural communities from a bigger landscape point of view. And I know you've also heard about this from Bob Zano. But still, with our current funding, only about 3 to 4% of the actions in our state wildlife action plan are implemented. It's a big plan with a lot of actions in it and a lot of species to take care of. You can imagine. So there have been decades-long efforts in Congress, at the federal level, for adequately funding these wildlife action plans, permanent funding. And the last effort was called Recovering America's Wildlife Act. It looked like it had really good chances in 2023, but in the end, it didn't make it over the finish line, which was too bad. It is not dead. There's still bipartisan support for it, and there always has been. But right now, they're not actively pursuing it. What we call RAWA, Recovering America's Wildlife Act, would have given us 20 times our current funding so that we could truly implement the plan for a long-term vision of conserving our wildlife in Vermont. It would have translated to a lot of habitat activities. It would have translated to supporting a lot of conservation partners. It would have contributed to allowing landowners to voluntarily conserve habitat. It would have really put us in a good position. We would have had 11 to 13 million a year, which sounds overwhelming. But that's what it would really take to implement the Wildlife Action Plan. And there's a lot of interest in that happening across the country. Let's see. And finally, just to wrap up, I always keep in mind that no matter the resources, whether we're well-funded or underfunded, it always comes down to people. It always comes down to working with partners, finding common interests, shared interests, and working together. We're going to continue to need that no matter what the funding landscape is. Maybe more so in some situations than others, but I really see that as absolutely essential to everything we do. And we hope to continue to be able to do that, Fish and Wildlife. So I'd welcome any questions the committee might have.
Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. I guess I'm struck. I'm interested in abundance and how you calculate that into all of these things you're doing. I guess I realized in my questions there was a thread there, and that's the thread, I think. So back to the species of greatest conservation need that you're taking off of a list, the numbers are remarkably low for you to step away, in the dozens, 50, 60. If I'm reading your graphs correctly, when loons are coming back, it's still not many loons. I mean, we're seeing more of them. What was the historic abundance of those species? Do you have any idea? How do you consider that? We know that we've heard many, many witnesses tell us about the dramatic loss, particularly of birds, over the last 50 plus years. So how do you decide, that many pairs is okay? And what was the historic abundance, if, pre-settlement, if that's possible to comment on? And maybe I'll stop there because the others are somewhat related, but I'll just see what your thoughts are on that.
Well, that is the golden question. It's a very excellent question, and it's a question debated in the journals. How far back do you go? What is your goalpost? Are we looking at pre-settlement? Is that realistic given all the impacts that humans have on the landscape, and given the size of the human population? Or do we need to go back to some other timestamp? And what should that timestamp be? A lot of times, so for example, with the birds, we go back to about 1970 because that's when we started collecting data. And so like, let's at least try to get back to that. We know we've lost a lot since then. If we just got back to that, we would feel very good about that, right?
And so are the ones that were considered recovered, are they back to 1970? You know,
Oh,
Bald eagle or the loon or the ones you gave us as examples?
yeah, I would have to look to see if we have enough data for those species to know whether we reached that goal. When we list a species, we set a goal based on what we think will ensure us a sustainable population. So there are specific goals in terms of the numbers of breeding pairs and the numbers of chicks they produce. How that goal is set has to be somewhat subjective in terms of what we think the capacity of the state is to host that species. So in figuring out the goals for a recovered bald eagle, we had to really look at the landscape and figure out, well, how many nests do we think could be realistically supported in our current situation, in our current landscape? And not expecting them all to be occupied, but what's a reasonable goal? And also that what goes into it is, what do we think will sustain the population, right? We may think, I'm just throwing numbers, I'm just making up numbers right now, but we may think we could have 40 nests in the state. Do we stop at 30 and figure they'll do the rest on their own? Oftentimes they do with something like an eagle. So it's species dependent. And this is a situation where we have really good information, right? And we can really figure out that number. So they usually have to meet those specific number goals for 5 years before we're willing to delist, so that we can make sure not only have they reached it, but they're sustaining above that baseline.
My other thought or question is about, you drew attention to the non-vertebrate species on the list of species of greatest conservation need, but I was struck by 51% of the mammals in the state are on that list. So the percentages are striking. And we have, whether it's permanently conserved or not, we have this intact. We've declared with Vermont Conservation Design, we're doing okay. And if we could conserve this intact and functioning landscape, we'd be doing okay. But if half our mammals are currently at risk with the landscape we have, how do we reconcile that? And what are we doing to address it?
Yeah, so part of what goes into the mammals numbers are bats. And those are one of those fine filtered species that have needs in very particular places in terms of their hibernacula and also in terms of addressing disease with white nose syndrome. So that's really contributing. We have very few mammals, and so that's really contributing with the number of SGCN species is the bats, which VCD is helpful, but it doesn't do the whole job. And it's really important to be carrying out other conservation measures in order to try to bring back those populations. So that's part of what's going on with the mammals.
How many bat species are there of those 62, presumably mammals?
Our SGCN, how many are bats?
Yeah, are on this list. Like there's 31 on the list. How many of them are bats?
Yeah, I think all 9 of them are. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so
A few are several are federally listed, but or state listed, but I think all 9 are SGCN. I want to double check that.
Still disturbingly high number of our mammals are on the list,
Mm.
even with those absent. And same with reptiles and amphibians, which I assume you'll say there's a similar thing. They have very specific habitat needs,
Mhm.
and they've been greatly impacted. True?
Yes, rattlesnakes are very, site specific, limited in their distribution because we have limited habitat. Spotted turtles are on there, very limited in Vermont. Wood turtles they're in better shape, but have a lot of, have threats. Skink is very limited in its distribution. So you have a lot of that going on as well. And some of it isn't, some of it is just that we have limited habitat, right? that if we just protect those habitats, we're doing what we can. And so they may always need to remain on our radar.
And then how does the wildlife action plan, I have two different thoughts on it, but how does it relate to extirpated species? You probably know we took some testimony about the reintroduction of catamounts. How do they fit in? And then opposite end, perhaps, how do game species fit in?
So when I think of game species, I think of moose. Those are an SGCN species because of them, even though there's been hunting opportunities as well, which is folded into one of the strategies for maintaining their populations. So that's a very, pretty unique case. And I forget the other part of your question.
Extirpated species.
Extirpated, thank you. So extirpated species, I actually wrote up some notes about those. So I thought you might want those numbers. Let's see. So we have two sort of types of extirpated species, possibly extirpated, which means they're missing and known only from historical occurrences, but still some hope that they'll be rediscovered. And then presumed extirpated, where they haven't been located despite intensive searches, despite a lot of eyes on the ground. So that might be something like a Henslow's sparrow, which used to occur here, but we haven't seen since around 1980. And we just don't have the habitat here any longer. So possibly extirpated is, we have 164 species, and presumed extirpated is 16 species. I didn't write up a list of all those species, but I could send them to you.
Is there a
Species are.
how are they included in the plan? And I mean, are they included in the plan?
I'd have to think about that. I think that some are included in the plan. For example, I don't know, I'd have to look back to see which ones are included in the plan and how many in the last plan. I couldn't tell you right off the top of my head. For one thing, again, going back to birds, because that's what I know best, is Henslow's sparrow is probably in the plan because it's actually still listed for now.
And how does the catamount fit into the wildlife action plan?
I don't know if that was in the last plan or not. I'd have to get back to you on that as well. I wasn't involved. I'm not on the mammals taxa team, and I'm not honed in on that. Was it?
Yeah, I thought
It was in the plan.
It was too, yeah.
Yeah.
Representative North?
Yeah, just a quick follow-on question to the chair, Rob Norris from Ferrisburg. The denominator numbers in that chart of percentages, the denominator of 61 mammals, clearly there are more than 61 species of non-game mammals in Vermont. So what is that 61 a measure of? It says total number of species, 61 mammals. I was like, it's got to be more than 61 species of mammals. So making the percentage 51% very high, obviously.
Mhm.
So what does that 61 represent? It's total species for mammals.
I think that is total species.
Seriously,
Yeah.
there are no more than 61 species of mammals that live in Vermont.
Well, it'd be interesting to look at that extirpated list and see how many fit in there, but yeah, this is intriguing. And so the wildlife action plan really is focused on these species of greatest conservation need and doesn't really talk about risks to currently healthy populations, or because we know a lot about those risks. How does it address those, or does it?
Well, I mean, one of the mantras that you sometimes hear in talking about wildlife action plan is keeping common species common. So in my view, in Vermont, we do a lot of that through planning efforts like Vermont Conservation Design. By implementing broader planning efforts like that, you're keeping those common species common, hopefully. If you're not, they're going to come on the radar if we have enough monitoring happening.
Mm.
So it's not that we're ignoring them, it's that we're relying on broader efforts in order to keep common species common.
And maybe, so what's the current process? We're updating the plan now. How can people engage with, what are some deadlines or dates?
So the 2025 Wildlife Action Plan is due at the end of the year. We may extend that because because of database things that have extended the time we've needed to spend just putting the database together. We're refurbishing our entire database. It's taking a lot of time. So we're actually meeting tomorrow to talk more about the engagement process for the plan. So stay tuned. It's still happening. We really wanted the taxa teams to do their work first so that people would have something they could respond to. And so they're still working away at threats and actions. And so when they're done with that, that will be a good time to be sending it out and getting input.
So it hasn't started yet, the sort of public facing part hasn't.
No, it's not.
Representative Austin and then Pritchard.
I'm on the Colchester Planning Commission, and I'm just wondering how the public and then we're beginning the process of thinking of, re-updating our town plan and how, I feel like a lot of this would need to be incorporated into a new town plan. And I'm just wondering how the public and regional planning commissions are becoming educated about, we've gotten a lot of information the last few weeks. And I'm just wondering how that transfers to town plans.
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. We do a lot with municipal planning in terms of getting to VCD on their radar.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the way through which to also communicate this wildlife action plan. Ideally, we would actually also do a separate effort, just talking about this plan and helping people to see what sorts of SGCN species they can support, and whether or not, following the guidance of VCD helps them to also support SGCN or not, or if there's fine filtered species that they can pay attention to. We're usually picking up on that anyway in the process of working with municipalities. We know when there's a rare natural community or when there's a certain, certainly a threatened or endangered species. But it would be great to do that in a more intentional way, in a more organized way, especially with a brand new plan out. So, so if we can get the capacity and resources to do that, I think that would be really important because that's the level at which conservation is often happening.
And just the habitat corridors, is that being coordinated across the state, preserving or intentionally looking at habitat movement, animal movement across the state?
Yeah, connectivity is a huge, one of the huge pieces of VCD. So
I know.
yeah.
How does that get communicated to, if I wasn't on here in my planning commission, how does that get communicated to me through the town planner? We have a town planner, so.
Well, we actually have someone on staff named Jens Hilke.
Oh, yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, so he's really our communicator with the
Okay.
municipalities around those. Yeah.
Okay, so he does outreach then.
Oh, yes.
Okay,
Yes, a lot of
Okay.
it.
great.
We would like to have 10 of him.
Yes,
Because it's very
Understandable.
important.
Representative Pritchard.
So back to the songbird stuff. Have you started to identify possible causes? And one of the things, one of the parts that I'm just wondering about if identified as a threat. For the time, I spend a fair amount of time on this, and I have noticed much more abundance of predators. So in what I've seen, over the last couple of years, there's a certain area near my house, and a hen turkey will come out in spring, later in the spring, and I've watched in successive years. It's probably not the same hen, but she will come out with 9 poults,
Mhm.
and by the end of the week, it's 6 poults, and then by the end of the following week, it's sometimes 2 poles. And it amazes me, the resilience of the turkey itself, having to deal with possums. So, I think crows are a big factor in the songbird thing. And I was just wondering, do you think that that's part of the loss of?
I think for some species it is. And I think that what's changed over the years is the increase in predators associated with human dwellings, right? You have more predators where you have more development. Generally, you have more raccoons. We're providing food for them in various ways on the landscape. So you have that happening. Also, in the fragmentation of habitat, you create more edges, and predators tend to travel along edges. And so that makes nests more vulnerable as well, especially for a species like a turkey, which lays its egg on the ground. They have certain strategies to deal with predators because they lay eggs on the ground. They've evolved strategies for handling that. But still, when you have a high abundance of those predators, it becomes a different equation for them. So that predators can contribute to declines in the big picture in terms of us having developed a lot of the landscape. And so we have more of those edges. We have more homes and development and suburban areas, right? And along with those comes certain predators, such as raccoons, that do depredate nests. So I think that's part of an equation. It's very hard to know how much of a part of the equation it is. But it again comes back to habitat. And if they have intact habitat, you're going to be largely dealing with that problem.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, I know. Yes, domestic cats are a very important predator of birds, very significant predator, I should say. I strongly recommend people have cats inside and give them a lot of toys and give them some love and keep them away from the birds who are very, very vulnerable to cats because they have not evolved strategies to be able to avoid being depredated by cats. And it's the biggest threat to songbirds.
Thank you so much for your testimony.
Thank you.
I appreciate it. And we always appreciate the work of the Fish and Wildlife Department. And like all Vermonters, love to hear about the wildlife. So thank you again.
Thank you.
All right, members, we will take a break for lunch and come back at 1:15.
Thanks for